Dumelang to our viewers here, the audience at home, or wherever you may be. I'm welcome to the third session of today's lineup of the Gaborone Book Festival. Let me take this opportunity to thank the curators and organizers of the book festival. Let me also not forget to thank our sponsor, the Institute of Development Management, IDM, for making this possible. Please also catch us live on social media platforms at Gabs Book Fest on Twitter, at Gaborone Book Festival on Facebook. And our hashtag for today is hashtag GBF21, and of course, hashtag Arabaling. The session I'm moderating is titled From Homes to the Boardroom, the Endless Scourge of Gender-Based Violence. I'm joined by three powerful women who made such a stellar or such a solid contribution to the book that we have before us. And this particular book can be found in your local bookshop here in Gaborone. It's titled When Secrets Become Stories, When Women Speak Out. So I'm joined by Sue Nyati, who is the editor of the book. I'm also joined by Dr. Zahira Gina Asbet, and I'm also joined by Ntokozo Malinga. So all my contributors, including the editor of the book, will be sharing their stories and experiences of gender-based violence as we forge along into the conversation. I will now give them an opportunity for them to introduce themselves. I can't wait to just hear how they introduce themselves. Welcome, and the floor is yours. I'll start with you, Sue Nyati.
Thank you for inviting us onto your platform. We're excited to be part of the book festival this year. So to introduce myself, I'm Sugolu Nyati. I'm an investment analyst by profession and a writer by passion. I have written 3 fiction novels. My debut novel was called The Polygamist. It was followed by The Gold Diggers in 2018. And last year, my 3rd novel, A Family Affair, came out. In terms of anthologies, I have contributed to 3 anthologies. And this one, When Secrets Become Stories, Women Speak Out, is the 4th anthology that I've taken part in. Whereas as an editor, as opposed to a contributor, which I've compiled, and I'm very proud of the work and the book and the work that went into it, and that this is what's going to be the subject of our conversation today. Thank you. That's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Sue. And secondly, that's amazing. I just can't believe the brilliance that I'm just sitting among such brilliance today. Secondly, I would love to hear from Dr. Zahira Asfat. May you kindly introduce yourself to the audience, please? I think her mic is mute.
Okay, now my mic was muted. Dr. Zahira Gina Asbat. I'm recognized as an academic and a writer. I'm also an editor. I edited 4 compilations, Writing the Samusa Express, Personal Narratives to Marriage and Beyond, Saffron, which also looks at personal narratives of Muslim women around the concept of marriage. And I also own a publishing house called Yiz House Publishing. I'm also the curator of the Josie's Books and Blogs Festival. Thanks so much for inviting me onto this panel. Thanks.
I think my mic, oh, okay. And thank you so much, Dr. Zahira. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And like I said earlier, when we had a chit chat before we got into, the proceedings of the day, I just said, I can't wait to hear from you all, just the brilliance that is amongst us today. And lastly, I'll give the floor to Ntokozo Malinga to introduce herself.
Thank you, Dr. Portia. And Thank you for inviting us. It's great to be part of the book festival. My name is Ndogozo Malinga. I am a banking professional. I happen to have studied social sciences and ended up in banking probably by accident. I moonlight as a writer, so I'm a blogger, I write poetry, and it's been great to be part of this published work and part of this anthology. I am also married with 2 grown children, so I know all about the whole work-life balance thing and trying to juggle a corporate career with family. But I'm really happy and excited to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you, and most warm welcome to you all. And of course, thank you, the viewer at home, because we would not really be here if it wasn't for you. We appreciate your presence as well. So perhaps just to kick off our conversation, I want to call it a conversation so that, we're relaxed, we're much more comfortable, we're just talking. Sue, as the editor of the book, I would like you to briefly take us through, your process. How did this come into being? Such a powerful anthology. I mean, I was really moved, by the stories that I engaged with. So how was your process in all of this? How did you get, to a point where you felt, you needed to put this out there, and most importantly, you needed to draw in voices, into the project or the book?
Just to have personal narratives around gender-based violence, right? I mean, I had my own story that I wanted to share, but I felt that, there's different types of gender-based violence. And I felt that the anthology would benefit if I was able to showcase, the different types that a woman experiences through the adult, her life cycle, from childhood, through to womanhood. And so I had this idea because, gender-based violence is such a topical thing. It's pervasive in our society. It's prevalent. And I felt that we needed, voices to it. What you find a lot is when the topic is brought up, it's always academic. Academic writing around the subject, a lot of theorizing around the subject. But really, do you ever get the human accounts behind it, which is what I was interested. I think people, oftentimes when it comes to gender-based violence, people just hear figures and they're numbed by figures. So I felt by, putting this anthology together, it's to give it a heart and humanize the whole topic once again, because people are just numbed themselves to the numbers now. It's like, oh, another woman died, another woman disappeared, another woman is raped. But, we're desensitizing the whole topic by doing that. So this is how, this is what I wanted to achieve with this anthology. So I came up with a proposal, which I then pitched to the publisher, Jonathan Ball, and they loved the proposal. And so that was when the work began, because now I had to identify, contributors so that the book could actually come to life. And how did I find contributors? I found them from, all sorts of places. It's not enough just to be a writer with this type of, subject. You may be a writer, but you might not have a story on gender-based violence, right? And I was very purposeful in terms of it had to be nonfiction, because there's power in non-fictional narratives, especially with topics like this, because as survivors, you give encouragement to other people other women who may be going through the same thing. So that was very intentional. And so, I found, women in different ways, in different places. But, some dropped out in the process because obviously, when you write about your trauma, it can be triggering, and sometimes you might not be ready at that point to put it down on paper. And even those who did go through it and put it down on paper also weren't really ready to put it out there. And so it was also quite another sort of adjustment to have your story out there in the world, being read and being dissected. So there were different phases as well. But I think finally, everyone who contributed, I'm thankful to every woman who shared their story with me and with the rest of the world, because there really is power in testimony.
Thank you so much, Sue. I mean, I like how you put it, that you wanted to humanize, the stories. I think about, for example, the rape statistics in Botswana, and how all we see is the numbers. Everyone knows that the numbers are alarming, but are we really getting what is at the core of these particular numbers? So I really, really like how you put it, humanize it. These are not just numbers, these are, like actual events. And are we really getting what is going on? And perhaps let me go back to the two other contributors. Like, how did it feel for you, Dr. Zahira and you, Ntokozo, how did you get to a space where you felt comfortable or confident enough to, to share your stories? I'll start with you, Dr. Zahira.
Sorry about this. When Sue contacted me to ask me to write, my first reaction to her was that I've never experienced that. How can I write about that? But when I actually looked at my community and I looked at what goes on, a lot of this whole idea of the patriarchy is something that I live in. I live through in my everyday, and I wanted to write about it. I've been talking about it for a while now, and I feel that it's a big form of gender-based violence that we don't think is gender-based violence because there's no scars involved. But we don't realize what's exactly happening. In the Muslim community, there's this big problem where women are being brought up for this sole goal of marriage. And then what happens after that is beyond their control, because they're not empowered. They're not empowered to study. They're empowered only to become wives. And when men take on second wives and third wives and fourth wives, these women are the victims in those marriages. And there's a big problem with that. So when Sue asked me initially, I told her, I don't think I'm the right person to write about this. But then I looked within my society, I looked at the cases around me, I looked at my own situation, and that's when I wrote the story, the narrative. Before the book was coming out, I was a bit worried because my narrative is quite strong and it will look, from a Muslim perspective, people will look at it in a different way. I think it's an important narrative that needs to be told. And I'm just hoping that people can act on it and changes can be made within society based on what I've written. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zahira. I would like to point out something in what you said, that for the most part, we look at gender-based violence as something that is occurring elsewhere, or the way we are raised, or the way we navigate life, or the way we are made to understand it. We experience gender-based violence without even knowing that we're experiencing it. So I like how you point that out, that there were so many things happening in our community, in your community, and when Sue approached you, you thought, okay, am I the right person, am I not? But I like you putting that, because for the most part, it's so normal such that we can't even tell that this is very wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we internalize a lot of our roles. So it's through our upbringing. And the funny thing was that, like, after I wrote my narrative, Sue and I had this discussion, and she said that there's a lot that what I wrote in my narrative is something that's cross-cultural, like the aspect of the matriarch. Like before marriage, we'd have these older women that would give us advice and tell us that this is how you need to satisfy your husband's needs, right? You need to, because there's always other women out there. You need to be that good wife. You need to live up to certain roles. And what happens within the society, within the Muslim society, is that men can take on second and third wives. And then what happens to the first wife? And a divorce has become so common as well. So then the first wife is then, she has to leave her home, she has to leave her family, and she's got to take those children, and she's sole dependent for those children, and she hasn't been empowered financially. So that becomes a big problem. And I actually think that my narrative will create some changes if it's taken to heart. Yeah. I think the big thing is that women need to empower themselves. They need to learn for them. They need to grow within themselves first and not rely on this. idealistic role of marriage. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, let's quickly move to Ntokozo Malinga so that she can share briefly how she got into sharing her own story before we can, quickly move into other themes that I think are much more important and we need to like look into and dissect the architecture of gender-based violence itself. And Ntokozo, how did you get to sharing your story?
Okay, so I met Lusu through a group of independent authors that we'd formed. It was more like a collective, which was really nice, really good engagement. When she pitched the idea of stories of abuse, and we all have a story, ours or somebody else's, it's basically felt like you take a deep breath and you jump into the cold swimming pool. That's what writing the story was like, because I had lived it and I had probably a lot of trauma from what I experienced, and I was at a point where I'm trying to move on, but I also understood that it's important to share the stories of what really happens in the corporate space, because the moment you hear gender-based violence and abuse, everyone jumps to sexual abuse, but it's actually a lot more than that. And I kept coming across women who had been through similar experiences as me, but would probably never get the opportunity to tell that story.
Absolutely. I like that, like you're highlighting that, there are all forms and all kinds of gender-based violence. We are quick to think about, physical, the ones that manifest physically, but there's a plethora of ways in which women are violated every day. And thank you so much for sharing your journeys into how you got to speaking out. Perhaps just to delve deeper into the conversation. When I was reading the introduction of the book, there's a very powerful line that I believe Sue, the editor of the book, wrote. She said, "You see, the thing about abuse is that it thrives on silence and it flourishes on secrecy." So I thought that was absolutely powerful. And when I read all your stories, I could tell that there was a common theme that emerged, suffering in silence, not talking about it. Because the book is about women speaking out. So I want each one of you to take me through perhaps your experience or any other experience of how this works, because that's just really what I call the architecture of gender-based violence. The silence of it, the looking away of it, the shaming of women for speaking out about it. So I want each one of you to share briefly about from that particular line and your experiences. I'll start with you, Dr. Zo.
Yeah, I think what is very important is that shaming and that silencing. And because my story is really about my career, I'm still very much in that field. That is why you can't see my face.
Absolutely.
And I wrote under a pseudonym because a story like this has the potential to wreck your career for a lifetime. And interestingly, as I was talking to one of my former career coaches, and I mentioned to her, that I've written my story. I found the courage to write my story, and partly thanks to her, the work that I did with her around, finding my voice and speaking up. And she actually said to me, I have so many similar stories that I've collected over the years of women that she's coached and counseled, but she's never been able to find the courage to put it on paper because she doesn't want to put herself out there and her face out there. She works as a consultant. So things like this can wreck your career when, the wider sort of collective knows about it. So that's where the silencing comes in, because you've then got to think about your family. What are they going to say? You've got to think about, your colleagues. You've got to think about potential employers. And I think now with social media, with things being so easily screenshotted and shared,
of course,
and WhatsApp and going viral, it's very easy to become notorious. And this has actually, I think, probably allowed the violence to escalate, because now everyone is just so sensitive about the word getting out.
Absolutely. Dr. Zahira, what is your take on this shame, and just the silencing of women. What are your thoughts around that, particularly from a religious perspective, being of Muslim faith? I mean, I
Yes.
read experiences that you shared of other women that and my God, I could not believe it. So can you quickly take us through that?
Yes. Okay, so if you've been brought up for the sole purpose of getting married and you've been groomed to be married, right? And you live this sheltered life where your parent says that you so protected and so treasured that you're gonna be the ideal wife. And if anything is to go on wrong in your marriage, it's gonna be something that you're gonna be totally ashamed of. You're not gonna speak about it. You're not gonna speak about that. It became like I gave an example of this of the one my one friend who has had the situation where her husband divorced her and then he got married soon after. And people said, but she didn't satisfy her husband's needs. That alone is like something shameful. It's something that you're not going to speak about. It's something even when you're divorced, you're not going to speak about. Because women are put into these categories of working towards this idealistic notion of being the best wife, to being the best mother, to satisfy that husband's needs. So I think with the silencing, it's huge in marriages. I mean, you're not going to talk about anything that really goes on for fear of what's going to happen after that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. It requires a lot of courage indeed. And I like what you're saying. That's really how the violence thrives, because it's
Yes.
hidden. You have to take it. You have to take it. You have to pretend that everything is okay, and you have to suffer. And actually, going back to Ndokozo's account, she also talked about the fact that even at work, you just have to take it because you don't want to lose your job, especially as a Black woman who's faced with Black tax and many other things. Sue, you shared something about a story when you were young, an experience you have with what you called a houseboy. This was someone who your parents had hired, and it so occurred that this particular incident happened, but what punctuated that event at the end was just the silence, also because you felt ashamed. So I want you to to share that with our audience and with the viewers.
Yeah, no, definitely. So a lot of gender-based violence takes place in secrecy. Like in my experience, when I was sexually molested, he told me not to tell anyone about it. So that's what we mean by the secrecy and the silence, because he silenced me in that moment, right? I became powerless. And that's what happens to many victims. You get silenced, you don't talk about what has happened to you. And because it happened to me when I was young, when I reached an age where I could understand what had happened, I could make sense of it, I felt shame. So it wasn't shame from external, from the outside. It was my own shame. I felt ashamed that I had been part of this, and that, how could I have let that happen? I took responsibility of something, okay, that was not my fault. And that's another shame that, a lot of victims of gender-based violence deal with, the shame that you internalize. You think you are shameful as a person, and as a result, it can play out in so many destructive ways in your life, as you grow up. And so when we say you taking, speaking out, you're actually like reclaiming your power, because if you're silenced, you lose your voice. But when you now speak out, you take your voice, you've regained your voice, and you're taking your power back. So that's why, we need to break the silence and the secrecy, because any violence, so even domestic violence, if you see a lot of victims, they also, hide behind the shame. They don't want to tell anyone. And as long as you keep in that silence, it will continue to flourish in that silence. So when you start to speak out, you're like breaking a hold over it, because you're just putting it out there, and you become, instead of being powerless, you become powerful again. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing just how how deep it goes. I'm thinking, how are you the person violated, and then you're the person that has to, to carry the shame? That really says a lot about the patriarchy itself, and really how we women have to keep shouldering everything, in our shoulders. And perhaps this also takes us to um, victim blaming. How are you guys understanding victim blaming in your experiences? And what can you say about it when we link it to shame? I want to start with you, Sue.
So, the shame is because it comes because victims are blamed, right? So there's always a cost with speaking out. Speaking out is not something that is easy. That's why people are reluctant to speak out. And that's why I hate it when people say, but why did you wait so long to speak out? I mean, why didn't you speak out as it happened? Or, because there's a cost to it. Like with anything, like Ndogoza said, you could lose your job, loss of reputation. There's a lot that comes out, loss of family. I know a contributor who got, cut off from her family, disowned literally for speaking out against, about the sexual abuse that happened to her. So there's a cost that comes with speaking out. It's not an easy thing to do, but as much as it can release you from the burden of carrying the shame. And society does protect the perpetrators. If you find a lot of the times people who perpetrate gender-based violence are always in positions of power, of influence, so that when the victim speaks out, they're not believed, they are dismissed. There's question on their integrity, on who they are. What were you wearing is always a common question when a woman gets raped. You were in a pub drinking. What did you expect? You see, there's so much, shaming of the victim, and less, there's less demand on accountability of the perpetrator. And so this is why I think gender-based violence remains pervasive and difficult to deal with, because there's a reluctance for society to hold perpetrators to account.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that linkage, because I think it's very important for us to link how all these pivots, or all these scaffolding, are able to maintain gender-based violence. It's the silencing, it's the shaming, it's the blaming. So Dr. Zahira, how about in your own understanding and in your own experience, or from the experiences of people how has that played out? The blaming of the victims, or people who have
Yes.
experienced abuse.
So I agree with what Sue says about speaking out. And I think from a Muslim perspective, from the examples that I gave in my story, I think the biggest problem is the finances. If a woman is experiencing problems in her marriage, and she hasn't been empowered in the sense that she hasn't studied, she's just been groomed for marriage, and now to speak out, knowing that the man has the hold of in society, in the household, in his family, she knows that she's going to be blamed. What happens after that? You see, what happens after that? I mean, it's easier. It's like this idea that you can say, speak out, and then you can walk away from it. But what happens to her in that situation where she's got to take her children and leave the marriage? Where does she go to? Does she go back to her parents, who will support her beyond that? And I think that's the biggest problem that we're facing now. We have this a very high increase of divorces in our community, and the men don't support the children beyond that divorce. But what do the women do beyond that when they cannot support themselves, when they were not empowered prior to marriage? And I think we're sitting with psychological issues. We're sitting with women that need counseling. They can't afford the counseling. We're sitting with situations where within our religion, men are abusing the religious power to the extent that when there's a situation where there's a divorce, they can take the child away and say that the child is their own in terms of the religious Islamic right. And women can't afford to fight this in law because they don't have the money for it. They go back to their parents. There's all the shame. What will people say? What will the community say? You came home, you couldn't keep your marriage, you couldn't look after your husband. It goes on. So I think to a large extent, women won't speak out. They'll rather rough it out in that marriage for fear of the reputation that comes with it, for fear of what will happen after that to them. Will they survive? How will they survive? The finances, that kind of thing. So it's a deep problem. It's an extensive problem, and I think back in the day, where divorce was not known, a lot this happened. This happened in marriages, but there was something. Divorce wasn't common, so marriages would just go on. It would be failed marriages, but they would just go on. Women would not speak out, and they wouldn't move home. They wouldn't leave the marriage.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Zahira, for that. Because when I read your story, I mean, I remember how you put it out there clearly that, you know, the moment you are born, you know, as a young woman, you're raised for marriage. So you don't go to school, you don't do anything. But in a situation where that marriage doesn't work out, then what happens? So it's you're trapped, basically. And I would like to quickly move to Ndokozo, because the corporate world is very toxic. And not only that, even more toxic to women. So what has your experience been in terms of, you know, this culture of, you know, just be there and keep it together? You know, what has your experience been with all of that, and Ndokozo?
Yeah, thanks, Doctor. So my experience has really been that if you are a victim of corporate bullying, you as the victim are to blame somehow. And yet people don't really understand the phenomenon of corporate bullying, that there's actually a very subtle psychology. The bullies choose their victims very carefully. It took kind of years of reading and research for me to try and make sense of this experience, which is why I'm able to write about it, and I'm able to actually help and counsel and coach women that are going through situations like that. I mean, I recently had to sit in on a disciplinary hearing, not really disciplinary hearing, it was more of a grievance procedure, where a female employee was given a bad performance rating by another female manager. Because what's important to note is that it's not just male to female, but there's sometimes female to female, because the female in the corporate has to identify with the masculine way of doing things in order to make it ahead. So you've got to be hard, you've got to be ruthless, you've got to be unemotional to survive corporate. And what then happens is that the bullies pick their victims very carefully. It's usually people who are bright, who are articulate, who are cooperative in their dealings, who are not toxic or selfish or ruthless. What the bullies then do is they put pressure on you to perform while they take the credits. That's one way of they do it. They isolate you so that you cannot speak to the higher ups. So you find in a lot of the cases, you're not allowed to speak to, your boss's boss. They isolate you from colleagues, because what they then do is they create little cliques, and everyone then understands that if you want to stay on the boss's good side, you've got to be part of the clique. And if someone is marked as the victim, then everyone has to either be a silent bystander, which enables the abuse and the silence, or you have to be part of the mix in terms of persecuting the victim. So the bully recruits. So the bullies generally, they recruit other people to be on their side. And then those who are not scared, who are scared or not comfortable being bullies themselves, become bystanders. They're the guys who, if you have like a public sort of meeting and there's issues being raised, when you're the one that speaks up, they keep quiet. Then they come to you afterwards and I say, "Oh, I'm so glad you spoke about this thing. We really feel that way, but we're too scared to speak up." So you find that it is a very subtle psychology. And when things really go wrong, and because the bully is in a position of power, and they start picking on you and they give you a bad performance rating or they fire you, which is what happened in my case, no one speaks up for you. You're on your own.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that at my grievance hearing, after proving that the charges that I was not performing were groundless. Eventually, the boss's boss, the head of the area, just dismissed the whole thing and said, "Ah, this is just a personal issue between you and your boss." And by personal issue, implying that I'm the one with the problem. He
Yeah.
didn't actually say, you as the line manager have created this problem by doing X, Y, and Z, which has been clearly demonstrated in the hearing. He was now at this point where he had initially been recruited to the side of the bully, being the line manager, and he had gleefully taken part in the bullying, which was what led up to me being fired and the grievance hearing, now me fighting back. Now he wanted no part of it, but he wasn't willing to actually assign the responsibility to the perpetrator.
Right. Right. All right. Thank you so much for that account, Ntokozo. I like what you said. Bullies choose their victims carefully. They know what they're doing. There's a psychology that comes with it, and then there's the microaggressions every day, the hostile environment in the workplace. You can't perform, when someone is always breathing down your neck, or they're just shooting down your ideas, etc. Perhaps what I also wanted us to look at is just how intimate violence always is. It's always the people that we know, right? Or it's always the very closest people that they are to ourselves. When we talk about corporate violence, for example, Ntokozo, if we were to continue from there, I think you talked about an opportunity that was passed to someone else, because they were male, and you were told not to even apply for that particular opening. Let's talk about that, because I think for the most part we just don't understand how toxic and how violent cultures are for women, particularly in the corporate world. And then after you, Ntokozo, then we'll go to look at perhaps also intimate partner violence in relationship setups, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Portia. So for me, at the time, I felt, oh, this is terrible. It's not fair, but what can I do? I need the job. What I've come to discover is that when you're in the corporate environment, it's so toxic, to your point. You want allies. You want people that are in your corner. You want people that get you. You want people that will, do your bidding. And it's usually the narcissists and the psychopaths and sociopaths and bullies that end up in positions of power. But at the same time, they're so aware of their own vulnerability that they want to pick people that they can pick on that will do their bidding. So when I look back, I realized that I was not in the in group. I was part of the out group. I was Black. I was a woman. I hadn't worked for very long with this guy, even though I had the qualifications, I had the capability. But he wanted someone that he would be comfortable with, who he felt safe with. And as an example, what would happen every morning after this colleague was then appointed to be my boss, they would sit and have little chats over coffee first thing every morning. And I could tell the temperature of the office changing each passing day as those chats happened, because what my bullying boss was doing was actually poisoning the head against me. Yet the head was the one that actually recruited me in the first place. He used to be both our boss. Now he was then promoted to be my boss because my boss felt more comfortable having another man report to him. And because they had a history that we didn't. And that affinity bias is something that we're now working very hard in the corporate space to break by raising awareness to say you need to give women opportunities, and also educating women to say you need to put yourself out there. This is how you equip yourself.
Absolutely.
But it's really just down to that affinity bias. I want someone like me, someone I'm comfortable with, and just not trusting that someone who's not like you can do the job and still be loyal and helpful.
Right. Thank you so much for your account, Ntokozo. Perhaps just on a continuation of just how intimate violence is, let me take it back to our intimate relationships, particularly for you, Sue and Dr. Zahira. Sue, you talked about that. We talk a lot about statistics. So now let's humanize this, because even in Botswana, the statistics are alarmingly high of intimate partner violence. You know, it could be marital rape, it could be being coerced to do something when you don't feel like you want to do it, but you have to do it anyway, because at that point it could be you know, a blow is just away from your face, you know, or I don't know, a cup is just away from your face. So let's talk about intimate partner violence. I want us to humanize it, you know, and how have you experienced that in your you know your lives? I'll start with you, Sue.
Yeah, so sorry, I might have missed the last part of your question because of the connection. But in terms of intimate partner violence, right? What we looked at in the book in terms of contributions was the different types of intimate partner violence. So everybody's familiar with the physical abuse, right? And the sexual abuse. And the abuse that leaves, you know, like scars or evidence on the body. But then we rarely ever talk about financial abuse, which also happens in intimate partner relationships, and emotional abuse. So you find that, you know, all of, you know, some of these are not like, it's not like you experience one, they can actually all occur together. Like, you know, like a buffet, you know, you can actually have all the experience, all these types of abuses. And it's also important, okay, so what a lot of people, because they don't know. So I'm sure you've heard women ask, is this abuse? He said this to me, or he did this. Do you think it's abusive? You know, I felt abused, right? And so it's those kind of accounts speak to that. So those kind of questions that you might have had. And yes, it probably is abuse if you think it is abuse. It's just that, you know, people only qualify it as abuse if you've got like a scar across your face, you know, or you were raped and forensic evidence was collected. Yeah, but sometimes it doesn't happen like that. Even in intimate relationships, you find, and I write about this, where, you know, a still thing where a man removes a condom during sex. That's violation. It's violation of consent. You may have agreed to have sex, but on condition that a condom is worn. But if it's removed, you violate the consent, right? Sometimes it could be, in essence, a question of you agree to have sex, and then someone wants to have anal sex and you say no, you know, so and they force you to have anal sex. So that's actually violating your consent as well. So there's so many layers to the abuse in intimate relationships, right? And this is what makes it difficult for, you know, a lot of women to say, okay, so how do I articulate this? Sometimes they don't have the words, or so the power in this book is that things that have been written make it relatable. So you will see it, you'll be like, okay, I've been through this. This happened to me, you know, and that's, you know, where the power of this kind of story comes in, because like I said earlier, with numbers don't really delve into the emotions and the feelings behind, you know, the actions and the violation.
I think my mic, oh, okay, it's unmuted. Thank you so much, Sue, for that. I also want to bring this to your attention, you know, the issue of consent. You wrote somewhere that you had an experience with a guy who was a boyfriend, and then he said these particular words after the incident had occurred. You never would have said yes anyway. You know, like how are we supposed to really wrap our minds around that? Like, there's just this huge mystification of consent. I don't know if it's a deliberate thing so that people can get away with things. I mean, how do you, you know, what do you think really about that? And I think that would also apply to Dr. Zahira, because you shared something about sex being availed to a husband because it's a marriage. Anytime sex has to be availed, you know, perhaps maybe let me go to you, Dr. Zahira, first, so that you can chip in this particular one before we go back to Sue. I want you to speak to that. It's this intimate partner violence. We are in spaces where we are supposed to be loved, adored, cherished, but it's the very same spaces where we are violated, we are robbed of our own dignity, as women. So Dr. Zahira, quickly speak to that, because we are almost wrapping up, but I wanted you to speak to that very briefly.
So, within the Muslim religion, a lot of the basis of the Muslim religion is on the Quran and its teachings. And when it comes to intimate partner relations, it's almost as if the religion comes in place there, and where the man will say, but it's, if you do not satisfy, this is what we have been told, is that if you do not satisfy your husband's needs, the angels will curse you until the next morning. So you live by that. You live by these rules that you believe, you grew up to believe that it's in the Quran, it's in the teachings, but it's not actually there. It's something that has been created through something that maybe a prophet has said that has been changed. Because how can you give consent based on that? I mean, so in terms of in most relationships, women are brought up to believe that. They're brought up to believe that they need to satisfy their husband's needs. They need to do it. They need to. And then obviously then in counter to that, then the husband will always say, but I can take on a second wife. Then what happens in that situation? And also another thing that with that whole second wife story is there's a personal situation where I've had to deal with somebody now recently. And the thing is that he says that he needs to take on a second wife because he feels that his wife is not satisfying his needs the way he wants it to be. And then my counter was that, so then give her divorce. He said, well, she has asked for divorce, but I cannot give her divorce because the Quran doesn't speak about divorce. So for me, that's flawed on all rights, because what are you saying there? Are you saying that she's not important to you to such an extent that you are not respecting your relationship with her? Number one. Yeah. Number two is that your rights come first, so you will take on a second wife to satisfy whatever rights you are talking about. And number three is you are actually bringing in religion to argue this point. And I think that's where the flaw comes in. That's where the whole patriarchy and the flaw comes in, where we use religion to support this. We use religion to support what we want. And that's where men, in terms of gender-based violence in the Muslim society, is where they use religion to support what they need. And that's the flaw.
Right. And Ntokozo, just a quick one. I know that you talked about these invisible chains. There's a line where you talked about, it was a horror at work and then it was horror at home in your experience because, you were stressed. There were all these changes going out in your work environment. But when you got home, you had a partner at that time who was also not working, but they expected sex at the end of the day. So how did you navigate that, and what are your thoughts about that?
I think back then, to what Dr. Zahira said, you do it because you're socialized, right? You need to keep your marriage at all costs. So you submit and, you find ways to get through it. There used to be an expression that the ladies used to use in England when they sent their daughters to be married to a complete stranger in India. And they said, just lie back and think of England. To say you're doing it as a national duty. It sounds very crass, but that's sometimes what happens. What I now understand is that the corporate environment is one where you've got a masculine role, or you operate in a very masculine energy. Driving, getting things done, and so on. But when you're at home as a wife and an intimate partner, you actually have to switch up and become soft and feminine and giving and all of that. And it's not always easy to make that energetic shift when you're so conscious that, in another 24 hours, you've got to go back, or in another 12 hours, you've got to go back to work and operate in that space again. But at the time, you basically had to just go along and do what I could, because I'm trying to keep the marriage together. I'm trying to keep the job, but it comes at a terrible emotional cost in terms of stress. And I was, sick. I developed an autoimmune disease. I lost my hair. I lost my eyebrows. I lost my eyelashes. And I know that is really because of that stress. But now that I know better, it's really just understanding how to manage my energy throughout the day. And at some point, then make the switch from the masculine energy that I need to operate at work to the feminine energy that I need at home.
Right. Thank you so much, Ndokozo. Go along with it. You have to keep the marriage. I mean, these are like the burdens that women have to live with on a daily basis. So perhaps as we wrap up, I wanted you, Sue, to give us a bit of a concluding word, and just to sum up what we talked about here today. These issues are very painful, but it's freeing if women can come together and find the courage, help one another to find the courage to speak out. So I really want you to, as someone who collected the stories, the voices, I want to call them voices actually, because it's much more significant, because patriarchy stifles our voices. So I want you to give us a bit of a wrap up, in going forward. What are your thoughts? What can we keep on doing better for one another?
It's to speak out. People say women talk too much. We actually don't. We don't talk enough. That's what I feel. We don't talk enough to each other about the things that really matter. I mean, what I found when this book came out was, even with women I thought, who I'm very close to, they had also gone through stuff which we'd never spoken about. Like, it only came up because the book was out. And it was suddenly, oh, this happened to me, and this happened to me. And it's only through the book, that sparked off, those conversations. And it was probably also because of shame. They probably felt they would have been judged, if they shared those stories. Right. So for me, as women, I think it's time to reclaim our voices. We live in a patriarchal society that silences us. As you grow up as a woman, children are not seen, they're heard. Okay. And then as you grow into teenagehood, don't talk too much. Which man wants a woman who talks? You start to shrink yourself, even in class. You find in schools where co-ed education, the girl starts to shrink herself amongst the boys. And so it's like we have to come to a place where we reclaim our voices as women and start to speak out, boldly about things that happen to us, even if it's amongst other women, in a safe space. It doesn't, I truly appreciate that not everyone will be able to tell their story in an anthology or come into a public platform. But amongst us as women, let's create safe spaces for us to share those experiences so women can unburden themselves, because women are carrying too many things about things that have happened to them. They've internalized all this pain and agony. So, we need to start, unpacking those things and taking them out. And I think for men need to start to appreciate what consent is, and I find, there's this, tenuous relationship with what consent means. A lot of men think consent is implied. If you go and visit a man, they think the fact that you're there is an implication that you agree to anything that will happen under, his roof, which is not true. So there also needs to be an education around what it means to be, having a consenting adult and having consensual sex as adults. So, there's room to educate, our men around issues of consent, because it remains a very gray area, and which needs to be illuminated, for the safety of women. And I think overall, if we're looking at gender-based violence, patriarchy remains, for me, is the root problem. Until we deal with some problematic elements that, around patriarchy, we will continue to experience gender-based violence in our society. So yeah, that's all I want to say.
That we don't have much time left. Perhaps much to conclude on a bit of a more positive note. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us and your voices, most importantly. But I wanted to ask quickly, what are you currently working on, Dr. Zahira, Sue? What should we look up to next? Because we want to continue this, we want to continue to keep the conversation going and to keep hearing more from you. So where are we now? What should we look out for? What are you reading currently? So just quickly wrap up that for me, please. Dr. Zahira?
Okay, so for me, I've written a fiction collection of short stories that's going to be published soon in 2022. I'm also busy as in academia writing some articles, and that's about it. Thanks, Dr. Koza.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Zahira. Thank you so much. We'll be looking out for that one. Ntokozo, what are you currently working on? What are you currently reading?
So I am, very, very much in the corporate space, still working a lot on trying to make it a lot friendlier for women. And creating that open dialogue and just making sure that women have safe spaces where they can actually express what is happening to them, and we can start to resolve that. In terms of reading a variety of books, I've started really delving a lot deeper into spirituality and the origins of patriarchy, because you'll find that there was pretty much a hijack from the divine feminine to the masculine, and that's why we have patriarchy today. So I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to synthesize those thoughts into some sort of published work.
Right. Ladies, thank you so much for your power. It's been such a pleasure being in your brilliant presence. And I hope we will be continuing this conversation beyond Gaborone Book Festival, or we'll be meeting again here in the next year or so. And you, the viewer at home, our audience, thank you so much, because we wouldn't have been here without you. Don't forget to tune into our next item on the lineup. And a reminder, thank you so much to the Institute of Development Management, IDM, for sponsoring the Gaborone Book Festival. And thank you so much to the curators and the organizers of the festival. Remember to share the official hashtags on social media, hashtag GBF21, hashtag Arbaling. And this is me signing out. Thank you.